So everyone, welcome. I'm really happy to speak with you guys today, especially in such a disruptive period, about navigating user experience design across cultural boundaries. I want to talk a little bit about my experience about this, why this is important, what does it even mean, cultural boundaries, and what it means for me in America and for you guys wherever you are in the world. And so it's interesting. I've had a really amazing career that started off with a bit of science and technology. What you can't see here is that I'm also a carnival dancer, and that was a statement that they were saying earlier. Here you see me speaking at the governor's ball, but by carnival I mean like I'm normally dressed in very scant gear, dancing in the streets around the world of the Caribbean and Africa. And so really interesting perspectives as far as like my lifestyle and the type of work that I do and the type of community that I tend to present in front of. They tend to look very different from me. And that's because, I'm from a small place on the island of Haiti. A lot of folks may not know where the island is. It's in the Caribbean. Some of you may have known about the Haitian earthquake that occurred there in 2010. I'm from the coast of the country, but every time I show people my home, it really informs why I ended up going into the field of design, research, and engineering, specifically for some of these cultural spaces. And this is it, right? This is the little home that my family grew up in. And, I'll tell you, I have amazing fond memories, but I definitely notice in America when I show folks this house and in South Africa, there's a visceral response to it. It's an instant, oh my God, you poor thing, Nancy, you must have gone through quite a bit in your life, to have lived in such a shanty place, right? I've heard comments about that roof, about, the fact that it doesn't look like there's any windows. And, the truth is, this is a 4-room house. The kitchen's on the outside. No, that chicken is not our only meal. That rooftop is actually better than any flat roofs that were designed nearby to be more aesthetically pleasing. This roof has lasted for generations. It actually keeps the inside of this space cooler than some air conditioning. But the biggest thing I notice is when I add additional context to this home, when I tell people this wall here, see this wall to the right of the house, when I tell them that it's holding behind a beach, all of a sudden people change their perspective on this little house I've lived in. All of a sudden, it's not poor Nancy, it's Nancy, when can I visit your beach cabana? Which is really interesting to me in the work of design about why that additional context somehow provides a little bit of a difference in perspective. And what does that mean for the folks who want to design for this, knowing that it's a little different? And, so my background's been interesting. I've had a lot of education in a lot of amazing places. I worked on my master's and PhD at University of Michigan, primarily in the fields of human-computer interaction and human factors engineering. I was fascinated by the fact that there was an interesting perspective of Americans and how to design for others. And I wanted to understand that. I really wanted to learn that, especially because at this point I had been traveling quite a bit. And just to give you guys some additional context, I've traveled to over 70 countries around the world trying to understand how design works and how it functions, how people use designs from other places. And I've worked with some really cool companies. You may have heard of some of these. I was a researcher at Google. I was a consultant, UX consultant and engineer at IBM. I was a human factors engineer at Intel. And as I kept working with all these companies, one of the things I noticed is that we had larger scale, larger impact, larger global reach, but less money, less resources, less team. And so here I am trying to build solutions for, kidney dialysis for the globe, but only with a very limited perspective because I'm designing in a small town in Illinois. So what does that mean as far as the implications? And that's the biggest thing here. The implications I've actually seen from these companies releasing technology around the world. Not a single one of these companies that you see above you here has ever created a technology that hasn't failed the world in some way. And when I mean failed, I mean harmed in this particular case. So typically when you think about design, this is a design process. A lot of folks always talk about empathy, but empathy often sometimes doesn't make it to the design process. How many of you guys who are designers have really put your heart into what the user wants, only to find out at launch a lot of the ideas that you had that would have created a great experience aren't at launch? This is something I've dealt with a lot. What appears to be happening is I'm being asked to empathize by the user for the user, but really validate the ideas that are coming out from our stakeholders, right? And that's not quite empathy. Validation is very different. And so what ends up happening is we end up defining our products, and oftentimes we even skip some of the process that might be impacted, like coming up with other ideas or prototyping or in some cases testing, and we end up launching to the world what we believe is what's best for the world. And that's often a problem, right? But there is also a problem with the way we understand users. And empathy doesn't feel like it's enough. It's become a bit of a buzzword to me. And for those of you who don't know, empathy is really just understanding the perspective from other points of views. The problem that I'm having with this term is that it misses this idea of context, additional context, and how that might serve you differently. And so, what I've learned from a lot of the design work I've done with all these companies is that privilege is really important when you're thinking about designing, how it informs it, and what empathy means when leveraging privilege. When you're in a position of power to deliver a product for the rest of the world, it's really imperative that we understand our own privileges in all cases, really. And so in 2018, I spoke at the UX Enterprise Conference, a global UX Enterprise Conference, and I came up with this concept called nobility complex because of so many design failures I was seeing. And it's this idea that people have good intentions and they do want to design from a place of empathy. In fact, they actually do care when they are considering who they're building for. But what often happens when those people are in positions of privilege is that they unintentionally create these solutions that end up patting themselves on their own back because they're not taking into account some of the bias that comes in decision making. If you aren't aware of your own explicit and implicit bias, it consequently leads to self-serving. So a great example of this is the Haitian earthquake. I talked about that a little earlier. My family, who lives in Haiti, went missing during the Haitian earthquake, which freaked out, of course, all my friends in America and around the world. And everybody presented me with solutions. They just knew I was in so much pain and they just thought they knew what I needed. In this particular case, they wanted to ship clothes to Haiti. Everybody was contacting me to tell me about how they wanted to ship clothes to Haiti. Now, clearly they cared, right? They were delivering something that might be a need. But here's some of the things they weren't thinking about. They weren't thinking about the cholera outbreak. They weren't thinking about the fact that a lot of this earthquake had no home. They weren't thinking about the fact that the priority might not be clothes, but getting fresh water. So if you're not asking me what the priority is and you think you know, who are you serving? And what the answer is, a lot of the times when I hear about these things, I tend to end up soothing other people's pain. While they think they're trying to serve myself, what it's actually happening is they're actually trying to soothe their own discomfort. So that's what nobility complex was. It's this idea that, it's not to harm people because I'm biased and I'm privileged myself. I naturally know that. I also know I'm naturally self-serving. And I also know that I'm working with team members, at least in my space, that need to launch. And so as a leader, it's important for me in understanding all of these things to encourage people to be the most curious versions of themselves, but also encourage people to speak up when something isn't quite working, because that's where we learn. And that's where hard choices end up happening. And so it's really important to understand that what I'm talking about when we think about delivering a product for the world or thinking about things differently isn't about excluding people. It's actually about becoming more inclusive. I love this image because it's a guy changing his baby on a bathroom floor. When you think about bathrooms in today's society, do you believe that you often see baby changing stations in male restrooms? Often we don't. It's not that the designers don't care about, men and their children. It's that often we do design from our own self-serving context, right? And so Whereas when you think about things from a more inclusive perspective, like maybe transgender who are now this consideration of all gender bathrooms, there's an opportunity to see something more in people. It humanizes people, if that makes sense. And so what I'm talking about is not, let's just build something that only cares about the rest of the world or certain cultural subsets, or we should, exclude white men, which is something that people automatically feel when I talk about privileged in design. But it's actually about how can we make sure that all of us are included so that we're building products that are more inclusive for the world. And so an example of something that went wrong, for example, when you think about inclusiveness, there was a bot that Microsoft came up with. It was a Twitter bot called Tay. Tay was her name. She was like your invisible friend. And as you can see here, Tay's not saying something very nice, right? When Tay was first created by Microsoft, the idea was that you could communicate with her and she would communicate back with you, and it would use AI to really have a robust conversation with you. What's interesting is within, I believe it was 6 to 8 hours, Tay turned into a racist, sexist monster. It started basically attacking people online, saying things like Hitler was right, I hate the Jews, and attacking women, brown people, things like that. They shut her down at hour 16, and the question is, how did sweet Tay turn into such a monster? With further analysis, one thing that we noticed was that Tay, while developed at Microsoft, was also tested in China for a couple years before it was released in America. Now, not understanding maybe the culture of America versus the culture of China, one of the things that occurs sometimes in America is that you can get away with saying horrible, atrocious things. Whereas in China, you might not be able to get away with saying something like this. So think about, you're building technology within another culture and then you're releasing it. In less than a day, your technology ends up attacking people. A lot of our technology actually ends up having those biases, whether it's something like a VR system that doesn't take into account the cranial structure of West Africans or Asians, or whether it is a watch design developed by a team of engineers that are males that forgot to consider the wrist size of women. A lot of design ends up losing its potentiality because we do not take into account some of the cultural opportunities by being more inclusive and taking into account other perspectives. So essentially, what I'm trying to share with you guys is that we need to stop designing for our own kind of westernized stereotypes. And I know that's interesting to say for South Africa, but it is a little bit of the same. A lot of the times when I travel and I work with other folks, I tend to see that people want to design things that they think Americans will like. And that is not the point of this. We are a global society. We want to make our products scale. And in order for us to do that, we need to recognize that we may be developing towards westernized stereotypes. And so I'm going to give you an example when I worked at Uber, where I was responsible for the insights across the marketplace in 77 countries for our product. So what does that even mean? How the hell am I able to scale design to 77 countries? And mind you, the reason it's so important for us to think about scaling this design to so many places is because imagine here you are as an Uber designer or researcher, and you need to design a pickup in India for a location like this. Can you guys tell me the estimated time of arrival? It's these kinds of problems we don't normally see or think to try to solve for when we're designing from the States. But if we can design for opportunities like this, think about the opportunities that we can do for designing for events, because we can design for spaces like this. It's really important that we understand that there are some things that actually create more opportunity the opposite way. And so I've seen that a lot of the time, that when we do take into consideration other cultures, let's say South African cultures, right? It actually creates more opportunities for Americans because it actually provides us more versatility. It does a little bit more accessibility. And we'll go into that a little later. So I talked about, like, here I am designing across 6 continents for 77 countries, over 600 cities. And this is our normal design process at Uber, right? You identify the requirements, you create some use cases based on those requirements. This is now the designers, right? We create some task flows, we do some wireframing and some lo-fi design. Then we conduct research, we iterate on the feedback, and then we deliver the development or work within sprints to our team so that we can launch quickly. And this is an ongoing process. The problem is when I joined on, we were 12 researchers across the entire company, and the majority of the researchers were in America. And I think we had one researcher in London. And here we are informing the design with this process for the entire globe by few requirements, but not really necessarily talking to people up front, right? And so I decided to build something called the Global Scalable Research Program at Uber. And this program is actually was designed to try to figure out how we could scale out a way to collect insights at different regions in the world. And it's less important to understand that I was lucky to have some resources. In this particular case, I only had headcount to hire Americans, and I took that American headcount and was able to leverage it to hire, with one headcount, 3 employees in India and 4 employees in LATAM. And what's especially interesting about this is it was not easy to find UX people. So I hired and trained these folks myself, but I looked specifically for folks who could see beyond empathy. And that skill set meant I was looking for storytellers. I was looking for folks with maybe journalistic backgrounds or film backgrounds, somebody who really knew how to share somebody else's perspective. And then I recreated the UX process in a way that was agile, that would take into account some of these different points. And I also just naturally, I think systematically. So you'll hear kind of a bit of that. So the first thing I needed to know when I started the company, I did an audit to see where are actions coming from. A lot of the cases in the States, with the engineers are building out the actions, we have something called a product requirement document. I think it might be the same around the world. It might be called something different. In this product requirement document, where the engineers get all the information of what they did, I decided to pair up with just 2 groups within the company. So we have different product areas. We have driver, we have eats, we have rider side, we have freight, and I decided to talk to 2 PMs for 2 groups. And within their PRD, I set up a checkpoint, which I call the global checkpoint. It was optional. It was said simply, if you are interested in getting global insights, click on this button and request and ask to check out your research, the work that you're doing. So they submit a research ask, there's a form. And in the form, it says, what are you interested in learning more about? And there's, different things. This is ongoing. Is this a one-off sort of thing? And a lot of the time, what I noticed in that form are that people want their ideas validated. I built this thing. I think it's great. Can you guys double check this in a few different countries and confirm to us that it is the most awesome thing I've ever seen, right? So in this process, we'll talk about the protocol in a minute that I leverage. If you ask a question and you participate, I also have this option to go into office hours where we can further make sure that we're creating a proper research question for your study. I make sure that you can submit to the protocol that works with our study, which we'll go over. And I also ask that you contribute to our research plan. That means that if you need to localize prototypes, you will help us. So if we're testing something in India, we want a map of India, right? We don't want to show them San Francisco. Then we start conducting research. So this is the first week. We got people coming in, they submitted a form, they're in office hours, we've have the localized task flows, and we start conducting interviews or intercepts in other places. So in India, Brazil, and Mexico, in this particular case, we were able to use our office hours for one, to do a preliminary gut check on some of our designs in these different places. And I will tell you, 50% of the time, we were able to provide information that was enough beyond just going into a study. But for the projects that moved forward into studies, we were able to, on a biweekly cadence in these places, have already users plan to come in to do general research. And so every Wednesday, we knew that users were coming in, right? Or every other Wednesday. And so with that time, we were able to do our different research, and also directly after that research, we were able to provide preliminary findings. So the way we set it up is we provided raw findings first, right? And then we provided more detailed findings the following week, so that we had people engaged, we had them bought in, that in less than a week, if your project is submitted, you could at least get raw findings. And then the following week, participate in a final report where they would give us some feedback. So I talked a little bit about the process in which they check in the office hours. In the office hours, this is where I try to make sure that we are not designing something that's validating an idea, but it's clear that we have a research question. It's really important here to take some of these ideas, these assumptions that we have, and turn them into questions, right? And so here we have the submission asked, we have the office hours debrief. We want to make sure that the product is also prioritized by product, that they are actually working on something that's not a nice to have or a luxury, but something that's a strategic win or a quick win. We want to make sure that wherever we're testing things, it's a regional priority. So for example, if we're testing cash, it may not make sense to test that in America. It might make sense to do that in a few other places, right? We want a commitment to impact from the product. Once I get people signed on, I need to hear that whatever they hear from our studies, they are committed to putting it in the final product, that they are committed that whatever the results come up from our users, because we are user-centric, that they will leverage that to impact the product. Readiness is one of the hardest ones, but it's one of the things that is really important. We've had to move studies around because people weren't ready, because maybe they didn't have things localized. But we let them know that this might push back on them being able to do their study right away. So it's extremely important that they are ready for the study. We also prioritize strategic long relationships. And then we ask that everybody who submits something provide feedback or a testimonial. So an example of a problem that we might have submitted when we were testing this out is somebody wanted to understand interpretation versus translation. Should we design in India localized language into the Uber app? What we learned in this particular case, we were doing a study in Bangalore where we had a team and we localized language to Kannada. What we learned was that people don't actually want it translated to their local language with certain cases because some words don't translate well. Words like swipe translated in a local language are actually more difficult and cause more confusion. It's actually easier in some cases to write the word swipe in English. So here we were able to test this out, learn some things about interpretation versus translation, and our outcome actually ended up becoming global guidelines where we could start to say, here's some information we learned. Certain words need to be written in English because they're more, they're associated with the American language, whereas other languages, there are certain aspects that can be translated. So when people are now looking at how to build out for India or for Brazil or for Mexico, we have some guidelines as to how to work with these. So one study, one request turned into guidelines for everyone in engineering and design. Really awesome. And this was all by doing local usability tests and co-designing. Here's some of the methods on how we did this. We ran parallel regional research. So that means that I actually had this rule where anybody who submitted had to at least get 2 different country perspectives. It wasn't going to just be, I just want to do a study in Brazil. It was going to be another perspective as well. So we were doing usability testing, card sorting, intercepts, design jams, which is just kind of a way to kind of co-design with folks. We did 6 one-on-one interviews. Sometimes we could squeeze in 8, but they were doing usability studies in this case. Our execution was making sure that our product teams at HQ and around the world who needed to test design in these global regions, we wanted to make sure that it was prioritized specifically at HQ so that we were building something everywhere. We did cross-regional analysis. So there were some cases where we compared things to different locations and showed how things might differ. We also let those teams travel regionally. So for example, our India team, when we had studies in Africa, we would send them to Africa because it was cheaper and it was closer. We built lots of interesting relationships. We had repeat engagements. Of course, sometimes you do a study, you learn some great things, you redesign, you put it back in. We made systematic changes across the board within the company. We learned how to do foundational research more effectively, which is interesting. And our ROI overall with this GSR program is that we ended up showing that we were spending more efficiently and increasing our revenue potential by doing these studies across these different cultures. And so in our first quarter, we were shockingly able to do 20 projects, and it grew after, it blew up. We did 8 research methods. We did 12 Uber-wide global collaborations. We had 16 product touch points. We had over 80 actionable insights, and we saved millions of dollars when we did an audit of the products by the end that didn't go through the process versus the products that did. This became a game changer for how we access and deliver insights into our products around the world. And so we learned that getting insights earlier on was very important instead of waiting till post-launch to see the disasters. We saw the direct informed trajectory on these projects. We actually were able to create new teams as a result of some of the learnings that we had. We were able to create guidelines, and we were able to scale to a multi-thousand organization, all with a start of an idea in one place. It's really important that if you have a vision to be inclusive, that we articulate it and encourage people to find that vision. It can be really hard when you don't think you have enough resources. So I'm going to make sure I end this with resources that will help you, whether you can travel or not, right? And I want to end by, well, not end, but I want to also add that there's a reason why you want to prioritize some of these differences. We talked a little bit earlier about accessibility versus excuse me. I don't know why I spelled that way. Excuse me. Versatility. I don't think that's a word, but I think I meant the idea of having something that has access to a lot of different kinds of people. And so at Uber, for example, one of the things that we designed was a feature for deaf people. Let's see if this will work. There is no sound on purpose. So in this app, maybe you've had an Uber driver pick you up if you are familiar with the Uber app. We have the screen flash. And the idea was that we're just kind of creating an experience for people who are hard of hearing. And so you'll kind of see it. There it is. When a ride is requested, the screen flashes. And so now we're creating a driving and working opportunity for folks who are hard of hearing. Interestingly enough, we did some studies to see how people reacted to this. And one of the things that was surprising is we learned that a lot of immigrants were using the deaf feature. They were turning on the feature because of language barriers. So it wasn't necessarily a hard of hearing situation, but here's a new opportunity that was introduced. What we were more surprised to find out was that regular people were turning on the feature because they didn't want to hear what people were saying in their cars. Imagine a driver who just is turning on the deaf feature because they just don't want to talk to the passengers. Here we are creating something for one group, and it's creating access for a large group, a large subset of users. And so we learned this with Cash too. We tested Cash in India and learned that introducing Cash to the Uber platform was a great idea as far as that location. And so we tested it in other parts of the world. So you might notice in Africa, we take Cash too. That all started off in India. So here's an opportunity where we learned from a different culture and we're able to create opportunities. And in this particular case, by creating an opportunity for folks who now have cash to leverage Uber, we turned Uber from a service that was a luxury, that means a service that was only for folks who had credit cards, only for folks who had that 3-digit PIN on the back of their cards in certain places, to a place that actually created more inclusion and more opportunity. And so now, because of introduction of cash, Uber is no longer a luxury around the world. We have more customers and we're making more money. In fact, as a result of that study in India, they became the #1 market in the world at the time for 65 markets. But when we took that design, that cash model, and tested it in Brazil, Brazil became our #1 market in the world. India became our #2 market in the world. Mexico became our #3 market in the world. And you haven't heard anything about America yet. We found a way to create opportunity in a lot of places that we didn't have before. And so if you want to scale, you want to forge connections, ideas, opportunities that improve equity, inclusion in a user experience, it starts with really taking into account some of our own biases and making sure we are not building necessarily towards westernized stereotypes, but building towards more inclusion. And so we talked a little bit just overall about delivering value beyond empathy. We talked a little bit about culture fit and context and how that can scale. We talked a little bit about discovering patterns and trends and reporting that out in guidelines. We talked about the scale and radius of influence with research and designing for these places by creating opportunities in places like Brazil, in places like South Africa. Here's a fun tip that we learned in South Africa, for example. We learned that at the time that Volkswagens were the most hijacked car in South Africa, right? So what does that mean for the way we design maybe for drivers in South Africa? We also learned that there's lots of really, really interesting programming in South Africa around the safety for women in driving. Learning that in South Africa gave us literally an opportunity to build something that now provides safety for everyone in the world. And we started that by learning in South Africa that these programs exist, and learning in South Africa there were certain issues with certain kinds of vehicles, and seeing how that scaled around the world. So the radius of scale with research is amazing, right? We learned about leveraging privilege with awareness and not necessarily beating yourself up for having it. I'm from Haiti. I showed you the home I'm from, but I'm in the tech industry. I recognize I have privilege, and because of the position I'm in, I think about scale. I think about the world, and I leverage my own privilege to create scale. And then we talked about creating opportunities through access. And then this last part is one that's really interesting that we haven't chatted about. And it's one of my favorites. And it's about over-indexing on underrepresentation in order to build for more equality. Here's kind of the summary of how you do that. How do you over-index on the underrepresented so that you can build for everyone? Just to take a quick step back, this product over here on the left is a product that came out of Google. It was really interesting. When they designed it, it was supposed to be a product that was supposed to clip onto yourself so that you could take pictures all day. What we ended up doing is finding out that this product was probably not a great product for women, because if you clip something onto women's clothes, their materials tend to be thinner. So that's, pulling away from things and exposing things. They tend to have longer hair. They tend to be shorter. Now, mind you, the team that was working on this product was all male. And I, as a woman, and another woman came in and said, this product won't work for us. You built a product that essentially works for just men. And so what we ended up doing is doing a study where we over-indexed on women. And then we retested the product on men to see if the men preferred the first product or the second product. Turns out men preferred the product for the women, right? Because apparently they also have thin clothing. Here they come in different sizes, right? And there's this little thing called breasts that I guess everybody has that makes it really difficult for certain things to be viewed. And so the product was rebranded and marketed. It's out in shops now. If you look it up and find it, it's not advertised as a product to wear on yourself. It's advertised as a product to clip onto other things. But here's a product that was quick to launch that we found out after the fact that if we actually designed it with more inclusion up front, it could have created more scale. And now we're kind of back to the drawing board with our next product. So here's some tips I have for you guys to close out. The first thing is try to design a platform with a participation ladder. That means that you have participants if you're coming into a study and you're testing things out, or if you want to go to a local coffee shop, make sure you are considering 2 underrepresented checkpoints, right? You don't have to have a team in India in order to find someone a little different to do your studies. I remember I freaked Uber out in an Uber Eats study when I had all the participants were immigrants that couldn't speak English. And they were like, how are we going to help them? And I said, who do you think is delivering your food? It's really important that we try to leverage insights from folks that are different from ourselves. So if you can, try to get at least in a different underrepresented checkpoint. It's amazing to me that just the simple idea of having a woman as a requirement in your studies is something that's not considered. Then you want to test your learnings on marginalized communities. It is absolutely crazy to me that I test things in Silicon Valley sometimes, because Silicon Valley does not represent the world, but here we are building and testing things in a place where a family of 4 is considered low income at $120,000 a year. You can get food stamps. It's crazy. And so what does that mean if you're testing stuff in these spaces for other places? And so I tend to try to test in marginalized communities where I have a little bit more of a variation to my immediate or primary market. And so I might actually do a study in Vegas because there's all walks of life. I've actually done studies in Disneyland about literally anything, just because I wanted a different community that had a lot of different kinds of folks, right? Now, marginalized, currently in Silicon Valley, I go to a town called Oakland to run a lot of my studies. And that's a community that I feel good about serving. And I think it's a good represented representation of a more global perspective than building maybe in San Francisco. You heard me say this earlier, turn your assumptions into questions. It's really, really important that you're not just validating ideas, but you're really thinking about how to phrase and rephrase things as a question. Instead of saying, hey, where can I send this clothes? It's more, what is it that you need? Or is this clothes helpful, right? Or is this idea a good idea? And then lastly, if you can, try to have diverse talent. It is so helpful that I am a Black person on these teams, but I tend to be the only one, right? And so I know there are lots of teams that are designing without a perspective of somebody who's a little different, So if you can, do your best to hire, retain, and be accountable for a diverse set of talent. Here's my information. You guys can follow me up on LinkedIn. My last name is spelled Douyon. It's a French name, so people tend to spell it Douyan, but it is not. It's Douyon. Follow me on Instagram or on Twitter, but LinkedIn is a great way to stay connected. And so that is my presentation. I'm going to take it back to all of you. Let's see if I can close this. I'm afraid of touching something wrong. Sorry, folks. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Sorry about that. Not familiar with this tool yet, but I hope that was informational. Oh, I see all the comments on the side. I'll make sure to read all of these. This is great. I hope this was informational. I've loved working on these projects, and I really, really want to help include the world more. I've seen so much. And in my position, and hopefully in your positions, you guys know that wherever you are, you have a scale of influence that can change the world. So please continue to develop to your cultures, fit your markets, and also consider looking at other folks. So let's see. Are there any questions? How do you balance the raw findings before deep dive and getting the MVP to market quickly? Does this slow the process down? A great question, James. So the raw findings, so the way I've done this, let's say your study occurs on Wednesday or Thursday. So the way I've done this with 2 country checkpoints is I'll do studies in India on Wednesday and studies in Brazil on Wednesdays and studies in Mexico on Thursday. So the raw findings are literally just fresh in your face. Typically, if there's a deadline and we have a study that we're completing, the raw studies, I would say you're getting results in 4 to 5 days, right? And so with that information, you're asking like, how do you actually implement it into the product? Hopefully you're not waiting too late to launch it, but there's always some things that you can do, even if those insights mean turning things off or on. So for example, we learned when we launched our product in, I'll talk about Uber specifically, in India, that our screens for our new designs took 6 minutes to load in India. And we were launching, right? In this particular case, some folks made a decision to launch, and we ended up losing 30% of our customers because of that load problem. And so it's really, really imperative that if you think it's going to be a launch stopper, I have been in that position, especially at Google, where I've said we may need to stop a launch in order for us to get this in because it is critical. Now, for other things that aren't as critical, it's always better to explain what's at stake to your stakeholders. So sometimes they won't consider. I remember I worked on a project called Google Fi. If you guys don't know what it is, it's a very powerful prepaid service. It was the first designer on the product, prepaid phone service. And I came up with 3,000 differentiators, and they only had resources for 7. And in the end, they told me they had no resources to put anything in. And so you can imagine working at Google, your job isn't to sit there for a year and come up with ideas all day, right? It has to make it to the product. And so I was able to try to find in some small way something where I could make a difference, but also I let them know what was at stake for not leveraging my other ideas. As a result of letting them know what was at stake, we actually ended up delaying the launch for 2 months. So I hope that's helpful. But it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. Oh, there's a few more questions. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, and by the way, for the minimal viable product portion of that last question, that was what was key that I didn't realize when I first started working with Google, excuse me. I now have my own prioritization protocol where I measure things by importance and difficulty to make sure that I'm working on things that are actually going to make it to product. And so it takes into account pervasiveness of the problem. When I'm trying to deliver a message, I'm like, okay, is this issue that this problem solves for, this design solves it, is it pervasive across the project? Is it important to our stakeholders? Do we have the resources? So a lot of questions that I asked early on. Oh, somebody asked what intercepts are. This is great. Intercepts are basically just kind of like coming up to somebody and asking them questions. So you can do an intercept by setting up a cafe study outside of a space and asking people if they'd like to answer some questions for a gift card. You can do an intercept by, let's say you were doing a study on rental vehicles. An intercept might be going to the actual place. A great example for me, I was working on kidney dialysis software for mechanical kidneys, and had a very, very short deadline. And so I went to a hospital and just talked to a few doctors about some designs that I had, and found out that with every design, fancy design I made, or anything that curved from something that they knew already, it actually decreased their time for giving an actual resolution. And on average, they have maybe 15 seconds to look at a chart to make a decision. So with that little information with intercepts, you can get a little bit of information to make a difference if you don't have time to run a full-blown study. Let's see. There are a lot of companies in South Africa that are still new to the idea of UX. Stakeholders are still not sure how to use research and often disengaged. Do you have any advice for South African UX designers on how to get our companies to engage with UX research? Oh man, I hear you guys. I remember when earlier in my career, I used to make all these ROI decks just to prove that UX was like a thing. And because no one knew what it was really. And when I started, it was maybe 10 years old. So it was really unknown. And so I'll tell you, like, for me, I'm a storyteller, and I am naturally a storyteller. So I have considered my position literally in life for the research design work I do is to be able to translate the stories of the unheard to the people who don't see them. That's what I think our jobs are. That's the constraint of UX, right? That's part of the job. You have to be able to try to sell yourself. I've been able to do that by showing projects and examples of profitability, and also showing examples of design failure. So one thing I do is I'll do a brown bag where I'll have people come in and talk, and I'll just show them examples of disasters that could have been solved for. And with that, it usually piques their interest. The other thing I'll do is I'll try to make research more exciting. So one of the things I'll do is I'll do a game show at the end of the year. It's called Winter Olympics. You guys can call it whatever you want. And I'll invite stakeholders to come in and say, all right, we asked 4 users, like literally game show style, just so they could get excited about UX. I wanted them to see how cool it was and how great. So an example at Google is, a lot of folks don't know that when your drive gets, your Google Drive gets full, you stop getting emails, right? Because it's all connected. And so I had to tell stakeholders the importance of why we needed notifications, and I presented it in a game show format. So anyway, I think that's the last question I have before we move it on to the next person. But I really appreciate all of your time. I hope some of this was helpful. Make it fun, try to sell, show some of these examples, leverage examples from other companies to share where their wins are and where they're failing. and really try to show that return on their investment is worth the pause, worth the time, and it doesn't have to be too much. You can test it out with a little bit of design, and once they get the buy-in, once you get them in, show them that it's going to deliver what they want still, then usually people are ready for more. So thank you all so much for your time, my after midnight time. I hope you guys stay in touch with me. I'm quite lovely and easy to reach. So hopefully next year or one day soon, I'll be able to see you guys in the flesh. So
Thank you, Nancy. I don't know if you know this, but your Twitter account seems to be blocked.
Yeah, that's a recent thing. Don't worry, I'm unblocking it. I'm
Okay.
taking care of it.
Perfect. Guys,
Yeah.
if you have Nancy's handle, I can share it with you as well. But we're just going to hop into the next room. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the brokenness. Hopefully I'll get resolved in shortly. But otherwise, please try to follow me on LinkedIn. That's the best next place.
Perfect. Thank you.